Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now today I've purchased one of these. It's a Palit GeForce GTX 1650, and when this card first came out not too long ago I completely ignored it. I didn't even bother picking one up to review. I read a couple of other reviews and it got absolutely slated. People were saying that if you want a card that performs like this, just purchase the RX 570, which is of a similar price and actually does a little bit better in terms of gaming. And for the price, roughly £140–150 here in the UK, it was certainly cheaper to opt for an RX 570 as well. And when you take into account the used market, you can find the 4GB version for under £100. So this never really crossed my mind, and today I finally took the plunge simply because I picked this one up on eBay for just £89. But it isn't without its problems. See, this is probably the cheapest 1650 I could find anywhere. It was described as not working. I don't know how the owner has broken it already. It hasn't been out that long, and there were certainly no other broken ones about. So we're going to open it up, see exactly what's wrong with it, if anything, and then finally review this card, because at the end of the day, if there's one thing that the 1650 still sounds good for, is low power systems or pre-built Dells. Things like that that have pretty bad power supplies inside them. In fact, I've just read that Zotac are bringing out a low profile version of the card as well. I wish I hung around a bit to try and grab one of those. Nonetheless, we've ended up with this one. So let's get it out the box, see exactly what's wrong with it, and bring you what is probably the latest GTX 1650 review on YouTube. So the first thing you'll notice is just how small this card is. I mean, I haven't got massive giant hands. I'm 6'1", so I've got 6'1" size hands, if that makes sense. And this thing really does look absolutely tiny. Look how tiny this thing really is. Okay, we've got the banana for scale, and that's actually a really small banana. Sounds like something my ex-girlfriend said. Now though, we must see what is up with this one. I actually purchased it from one of those sellers who buys back broken cards from consumers. You know, the ones who say, oh, I got this as part of a large customer return stock from a PC retailer and we are unable to test it due to not having the appropriate facilities. Things like that, you know. So I took the chance and here we are. Okay, so over to the test system. We're going to install the 1650 now. We've got the i5-8400, something I use instead of the Ryzen 5 for game tests because it produces slightly better frame rates. We've got 16 gigs of DDR4, overclocked to 3200 MHz, and we've got an MSI Z370A Pro, unnecessary for the i5 I know, but it's just handy should I want to upgrade in a couple of years time to say an i7, something like that. But I'll probably switch to Ryzen again before then, so it's irrelevant really. This was just on sale for like £50. Anyway, the 1650's going in. And there we are, just like that. No need for one of these pesky cables. None of that getting in the way. We'll just tuck that down there. And there we are, ready to go. So, this cable is ridiculous. I just need to point that out. Amazon decided in their infinite wisdom that instead of the 2-foot one I ordered, they'd send me a 4-metre HDMI cable because the 2-foot one was out of stock, which somehow makes for a sensible replacement. But let's go ahead and turn the PC on. And there we have it. The 1650 seems to be working just fine. At least we've got to the Windows home screen. Yeah, there doesn't seem to be any artifacts on the screen, anything like that. It all seems to be okay. So I guess all we can do now is use this for a bit, see if we've actually got a pretty decent bargain here, or whether or not the 1650 decides to start having a few issues. So at this point it's safe to assume that my Palit GTX 1650 Storm OC edition here is working correctly. I've been playing games all day, and while I throw up some benchmark figures, let's talk about this thing. This particular version is among the cheapest cards when bought new. It features a 1485 MHz base clock and 1725 MHz boost clock, with 4 gigs of GDDR5 VRAM and support for up to 4K resolution at 60Hz. It's a 75 watt card and therefore requires no 6-pin power connector. A 300 watt PSU is recommended. I don't know why it was listed as faulty, but it seems the company I bought it from genuinely didn't test it. I think they buy lots of usually broken or problematic GPUs, so they just assume that everything that comes in as part of the wholesale lots don't work. So perhaps the first owner just had a really bad power supply that couldn't handle this thing. That's hard to believe considering it will run on nearly anything, but I can't see a reason why it would be deemed faulty otherwise. It can handle a lot of games at 1080p with the high preset, averaging 60 frames per second or near it. I mentioned before that the RX 570 costs less and performs better, but I think for say Dell or HP pre-builts, the ones with questionable power supply units that lack a 6-pin cable, this card would be the most powerful thing you could stick in there. And that's the only thing I could recommend this for. I thought that in the month I've waited before shopping for one of these, the price might have gone down, so it would be easier to recommend, but I guess not. You've heard it all before though, I'm sure. The purpose here was to fix up a broken card, one that I thought was broken anyway, and it turns out I didn't even need to do that. So at £89 it wasn't a bad deal in the end. Still, I'd like to see the RRP drop to maybe £119 or even £99, because I think it could do a lot more damage to the competition there, considering its small size and ability to fit in a wide variety of machines too. This is like the ideal card for those who hate spending too much on power supplies. You know, I don't recommend cheaping out on a PSU, but if you did, then one of these cards would be perfect, as it would likely run fine. There wasn't any hint of a secret message there, I hope, because I genuinely wouldn't recommend it. You'll never know when you'll want to upgrade your GPU, and if you've got a not so great PSU in there, well, it might mean that the whole thing goes boom. So you've seen what it can do in modern AAA titles so far, but let's finish off the video with a few more demanding games and see how it continues to handle them when using 1080p Full HD resolution as well as the high settings, because that's something that it seems to be quite comfortable with in most scenarios, though as you may have seen there might be some slowdown in certain instances. Assassin's Creed Odyssey in itself is one of those examples, and Battlefield 5 will have moments where the frame rate does drop into the high 40s. So continuing our gaming session with the GTX 1650 here and moving on to Just Cause 4, I was pleasantly surprised with the result. 1080p with the highest settings, as we've used throughout, produced an average of 68 FPS with a 1% low of 51 and a 0.1% low of 25, indicating a little bit of stutter. There were a couple of occasional dips, nothing game breaking here. Just Cause 4 is of course more reliant on the graphics card, so it's no surprise to see the 1650 struggling in some areas of the game, but with an average like that I think it was a pretty decent performance. Now Metro Exodus tends to fare a lot better if you take the benchmark result from in-game as opposed to the built-in benchmark test. I did that nonetheless because it's a worst case scenario type thing, and here if you use the high settings you'll probably see around 32 frames per second with the GTX 1650. I overestimated its power here. I think the best bet here is normal settings in Metro Exodus, though as I said before, once you're actually playing the game you should have a much better time anyway. Now next up I tried another Assassin's Creed game. You saw Assassin's Creed Odyssey at the start, but here I decided to try the remastered version of 3 simply because it's quite demanding when compared to the original version of the game. I do believe it's capped at around 63 FPS as well though, something that we were easily achieving with the high settings and the GTX 1650. There weren't really any frame drops to speak of. It was a pretty decent result and I'm happy with how this one played. It's a great game to revisit if you never played the original, or Assassin's Creed 3 was just one of your favourites, like it was mine. Now The Witcher 3 is an ageing game now, but it's still an absolute classic and one that I'd still recommend playing. Here with the GTX 1650 with the high preset and any form of hairworks turned off, we were averaging 63 frames per second. We had the frame rate limit set to, well, unlimited, and as you can see by the 1% and 0.1% results, there were a few stutters here and there, but again, just like with Just Cause 4, nothing game breaking. I'd recommend turning the hairworks off. It gets you another, say, 4 to 5 frames per second, which can really help in the busier areas like Novigrad. Here we were just doing a little bit of walking around the map. I played the game for about 25 minutes, and this was the result. Now when playing Shadow of the Tomb Raider, we were just 1 frame away from averaging 60. I played a solo score attack level. As you can see, we averaged 59 frames per second with a 1% low of 48 and a 0.1% low of 35, indicating a very smooth gameplay experience indeed. Now, Shadow of the Tomb Raider is considered
quite demanding when it comes to certain graphics cards, but here it ran just about fine. If you did want a solid 60 frames per second, you didn't really want to drop below that, then I'd recommend either the normal or the low settings just to guarantee that frame rate, but I think high here is perfectly enough or close to 60 frames per second. Overall, the 1650, well, you've seen all the reviews on it already, I'm sure. It just exists. It just does things. It can play games fairly well, but then again, you know, if we're talking about building a PC and you've got a half decent PSU in there with a 6-pin connector, I don't know why you wouldn't choose the RX 570. If you have a low profile system, a weak power supply, or a small form factor PC, then the 1650 would make a very nice addition to it. But as it stands right now, well, I couldn't recommend it over the aforementioned RX 570 in a traditional size custom build. If you can, of course, find it at a price like I found mine, then I think it would be worth it. So with all that said, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed it, leave a like on it. Leave a dislike if you didn't. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and hopefully I'll see you all in the next one. Let me know as well if you own one of these and what you think of it.